Whitehall Palace, December 1546. The corridors of Whitehall groaned with age and cold. Winter gripped London in a frost-bitten silence, but the heart of the Tudor court was not still. Within the vast chambers of the palace, servants tiptoed like wraiths, nobles whispered behind heavy doors, and in the innermost sanctum, where the air stank of rot and perfume, sat King Henry VIII. He was a monument now, not a man. The once golden prince, the warrior king who had jousted with valor and danced with grace, had grown monstrous. At 55, his swollen frame could barely rise from his bed without the aid of pulleys and 6 trembling men. His face, bloated and pallid, was crisscrossed with veins. His eyes, once sharp and cunning, now burned with a febrile gleam that seemed both lucid and lost. But his voice still commanded. Even now, when he bellowed for his doctors, the timbers of Whitehall seemed to bow. "Bring me the leeches," he howled. "My leg is cursed again." His ulcerated leg was a realm of agony all its own. The wound oozed steadily, emitting a sickly sweet stench that no herbs could mask. Physicians argued over the best course: cauterize, lance, bleed, or simply pray. None succeeded. The king's pain became the court's rhythm. His screams set the pace for each day. Catherine Parr, his 6th wife, moved like a ghost through the shadows of the palace. She had learned to survive through silence, through tact, through carefully chosen scripture. Her marriage to Henry was less union than treaty. She offered him companionship, intelligence, and religious moderation. In return, she asked only to live. But even Catherine, astute as she was, could not deny what loomed. The king was dying. He refused to speak of death. He spoke only of eternity, of his kingdom's legacy, of his son Edward, of God's divine favor. But behind his proclamations was fear. At night, when the candles dimmed and even his guards dozed lightly in the antechambers, Henry whispered to ghosts. It began with dreams. He dreamed of Anne Boleyn, her hair black as raven feathers, her eyes wide with accusation. She stood beside the chopping block, cradling her head in her arms like a child. Catherine Howard came next, her voice like wind through broken glass. "Uncle, why did you not save me?" He woke in fits, sweating and shrieking. "Witchcraft," he muttered. "They curse me still." His confessor, Bishop Gardiner, insisted that demons preyed upon the guilty. Cranmer, more cautious, suggested that perhaps the king's conscience sought atonement. But Henry laughed at conscience. "I have ruled as God's anointed. Let none question my justice." Yet doubt grew like mold. At council meetings, he stared at each nobleman as if weighing their loyalty grain by grain. Thomas Seymour smirked too often. Norfolk spoke with too much conviction. Gardiner prayed too loudly. None were above suspicion. Paranoia settled like dust. Only Prince Edward, his sickly 9-year-old heir, could soften the king's gaze. Henry adored the boy, his golden hope, his divine legacy. But even Edward had begun to flinch when his father summoned him. The smell, the anger, the confusion, it overwhelmed him. Outside the palace, rumors stirred. Some said the king was already dead and that a shadow ruled in his place. Others spoke of the devil, claiming Henry's pact for power had come due. A few whispered of Anne Boleyn's ghost, walking the tower at night, smiling. And in the kitchens, the servants told tales. How the rats no longer approached the king's chamber, how the candles there flickered without wind, how once, just once, a mirror refused to show his reflection. It was Catherine who found him one morning, staring into a polished silver plate. "Do you see her?" he asked, without looking at his queen. His breath was labored. "See who, Majesty?" "My mother, Elizabeth of York. She told me I would rot like Richard." Catherine knelt beside him, her hand steady on his arm. "You are not Richard. You are Henry, defender of the faith." He turned to her, his eyes hollow. "Then, why do I see the tower burning in my sleep?" Catherine had no answer. Whitehall grew colder. The fireplaces could not warm its stone. The king's chambers became a mausoleum. Each day, fewer courtiers dared enter. Those who did carried lavender to their nostrils. And still, Henry plotted. He revised laws. He signed edicts. He scrawled notes in the margins of Bibles and decrees. He summoned his advisers in the dead of night, testing their loyalty, whispering of enemies within. He ordered executions, quiet ones, a clerk in Kent, a midwife in Essex. Heresy, he claimed, but others believed he was silencing secrets. Meanwhile, Catherine prayed. She prayed for mercy, not for Henry, but for England. For she knew the shadow of the throne was growing, and soon it would cover them all. The new year arrived not with joy, but with dread. January of 1547 crept into Whitehall like a thief in the night, and with it came a deeper chill, one not born of winter, but of decay. The courtiers still performed their rituals, bows murmured, pleasantries, feigned laughter. But none dared to speak of the truth. The king was more corpse than sovereign. His chambers had become a place of whispered rumors and fearful glances, as if death itself stalked the hallways in velvet slippers. Henry's hallucinations deepened. He now claimed to hear footsteps in the corridors outside his bedchamber, even when none were there. Sometimes he would sit bolt upright and shout for guards to seize the intruders. Once he insisted he saw Anne Boleyn walking the garden in moonlight, her head crooked in her hands. The guards searched the grounds by torchlight. They found nothing but frostbitten hedges and silence. Henry's mind, already fraying, turned venomous. He accused old friends of treachery. Lord Surrey was arrested, accused of conspiring to seize the throne. His trial was swift and brutal. The execution was ordered before dawn. Catherine Parr wept quietly that night. She had known Surrey as a boy. Meanwhile, Henry issued fresh proclamations. Anyone who questioned his divine authority was to be treated as a traitor. The punishments became barbaric again. Drawing and quartering, boiling, branding. The smell of smoke and burnt flesh drifted through the alleys of London. Yet none suffered more than Henry himself. His leg worsened. The wound, blackened at the edges, bled constantly. The court physicians resorted to using maggots to clean the flesh. He screamed so violently during their application that 3 servants fainted, and always the dreams returned. "You will burn, Henry," Catherine Howard whispered in the dark. He thrashed in bed. No more ghosts. But the ghosts came anyway. Thomas Cranmer, ever cautious, suggested that the king retire from public view and rest. But Henry dismissed the idea. "I am not some failing bishop. I am the Lion of England." Yet even lions die. As his body failed him, Henry began to write endlessly. Letters to nobles, to ambassadors, to the Pope, whom he still pretended not to recognize, and even to Anne Boleyn. These were found in his chambers, unsigned, the writing jagged and uneven. Catherine Parr discovered a bundle of them tucked beneath. A tapestry, some were written backward, others in Latin with strange annotations in the margins. "What do they mean?" she asked Bishop Gardiner. He glanced at one and paled. "I do not know, but I feel he speaks not only to the dead but to something older." Henry's orders grew stranger. He demanded all portraits of his past wives be destroyed, yet he refused. To burn Anne Boleyn's. He kept it beside his bed. He spoke to it nightly. The court became unstable. Factions formed, broke, and reformed again. The Seymours pushed for Prince Edward's future to be secured by military regents. Norfolk insisted on a council of nobles. Gardiner warned that if the boy king ascended without divine guidance, God would withdraw his favor entirely. Henry listened to all and trusted none. In the Privy Council chamber, daggers were drawn, metaphorically. For now, the kingdom waited. In the kitchens, the servants whispered anew. They said the king was being poisoned slowly, not by enemies, but by his own body, that his blood had turned to pitch, that the ghosts in the corridor now spoke not only to him, but to anyone who listened too long near his door. One night, a guard collapsed screaming, insisting he had seen Queen Jane Seymour holding their infant son by a river of blood. He was removed, silenced, but others began to see them too. The women Henry had wronged, each wandering the corridors, weeping or staring silently at the walls. Catherine. Parr began sleeping with a candle lit beside her Bible, and Prince Edward, pale and trembling, asked one day, "Mother, will Father haunt me too?" She had no answer. In the waning days of January 1547, Whitehall Palace became a court not of majesty, but of dread. No longer the vibrant heart of English rule, the palace had transformed into a haunted vessel, a citadel presiding over the slow decay of a king and the bitter struggle for what would come after. Within the cloistered confines of the Privy Council, the realm's most powerful men gathered in increasing secrecy. The council chamber, once a place of debate and ceremony, was now a theater of shadows. Red velvet curtains remained perpetually drawn. Candles burned low and thick, choking the air with wax and smoke. At the head of the table sat Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, uncle to Prince Edward, and a man ambitious beyond measure. His sharp eyes scanned the room like a falcon's, watching every twitch, every pause. Opposite him, Bishop Gardiner clutched his Bible, but wore a cloak of politics. No scripture could sanctify. Thomas Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor, jotted notes with an ink-stained hand, while casting glances at the door, as if fearful the king's ghost would burst through at any moment. And beside them, silent and unreadable, sat the Duke of Norfolk, his hands clasped, his eyes heavy with fatigue and something darker. "We must prepare," Hertford finally said. "The king has hours, perhaps a day, maybe less." Wriothesley nodded. "The succession must be confirmed." Gardiner bristled. "Confirmed by whom? Parliament lies idle. The realm holds its breath. The church will not anoint a boy without—" "Divine sign. The boy is the sign," Hertford snapped. "Edward is the son of Jane Seymour, God's chosen queen, the only one who gave Henry a male heir. But the boy is 9, Norfolk said, voice gravel thick. "He will be eaten alive by these wolves. You may protect him for now, Seymour, but what of later?" The room fell silent. Each man knew the truth. Henry had left no clear path. He refused to name a Lord Protector. He had spoken of councils, of guardianships, of divine favor and vengeance in equal measure. He had trusted no one, and now he left, behind a vacuum. It was Catherine Parr who ventured a suggestion, timid though it was. Invited to one meeting, she wore mourning colors despite Henry still clinging to life. "Let us act not for ambition," she said, "but for the child. England has no appetite for civil war again." "Civil war?" Wriothesley scoffed. "There is no York or Lancaster now." "There is always a York," she said quietly, "and ambition sleeps in every cradle of nobility." Her words lingered long after she departed. In the shadows of the council, secret letters flew like sparrows. One to the French ambassador, another to the emperor. Promises were made, names offered. The Scots were mentioned, the Irish, the Pope, and beneath it all, fear. For the king, though barely alive, still ruled. Still signed his name with a trembling hand and a dying fury. He had spies even now, listening at doors, reporting whispers. One page was found strangled in the gardens, his fingers ink-stained, a note hidden in his shoe. The council declared it a suicide, but no one believed it. Then came the night. January 27th. The king screamed, not from pain, but from something else. Witnesses swore the cries echoed like thunder, that the very walls of Whitehall shook. When servants entered, Henry was on the floor beside his bed, eyes open, mouth agape. He spoke to no one, not even Cranmer, who arrived breathless and pale, dared approach. For the rest of the night, the king did not sleep. He stared into the shadows, mouthing names: Elizabeth, Arthur, Anne, Edward, mother, father, Cromwell, and then, finally, God. By morning, his breath was shallow. The stench from his leg had overtaken the chamber. Candles were lit in every corner, but none pierced the gloom. Gardiner whispered prayers. Catherine sat in silence. Edward was kept away. At noon, the council met one final time before death arrived. They agreed to seal the palace. No one would know of the king's passing until plans were secured. A coronation would be prepared. letters dispatched, guards rotated, and above all, silence. For if word spread before they were ready, the kingdom might fracture. Pretenders might rise. Enemies might strike. England, they knew, stood on a knife's edge. And so, as Henry lay dying, the Council of Shadows ruled. The morning of January 28th arrived without fanfare, cold and gray, a colorless dawn that swept across the Thames and settled like ash over Whitehall Palace. The courtiers, chambermaids, and guards moved through the halls with quiet dread, each step weighted by anticipation. In the king's privy chamber, silence reigned. Henry VIII, once the Lion of England, now lay motionless upon his vast ornate bed. His body was swollen and decaying, his features nearly unrecognizable beneath layers of bloat and sweat. The once mighty monarch who had torn a nation from the Pope's grasp, married 6 queens, and cast friends and enemies alike to the block, now gasped for air with the frailty of a dying child. Thomas Cranmer had returned at first light. The Archbishop's face was ashen, his hands trembling as he clutched his Book of Common Prayer. Catherine Parr sat beside the bed, holding Henry's mottled hand, whispering hymns through silent tears. "Speak, Your Majesty," Cranmer urged softly. "If you hear me, press my hand." Henry's eyes flickered. A long, strained breath followed, a hiss rather than a sigh, then a single twitch of the fingers. "He is aware," Cranmer said, voice catching. It was enough. With the rites spoken and the king's soul commended to God, the great Henry Tudor exhaled one final time. A gurgle followed, his chest fell, and then stillness. The room remained silent for a long while, as if time itself refused to acknowledge the passing. Outside the window, a crow perched on the frosted ledge, watching with baleful eyes. When at last the silence broke, it was Catherine who spoke. "God have mercy on us all." The council acted swiftly. Edward Seymour summoned guards to secure the entrances. Messengers rode out before the dawn broke fully, bearing secret letters sealed with the Privy Council's mark. In St. James's, the 9-year-old Prince Edward was already being dressed for a meeting he did not yet understand. Inside Whitehall, the king's body was swaddled in linen and draped with a black velvet shroud. 4 gentlemen of the chamber remained by the bed, their faces blank as they prepared to keep vigil. No trumpets, no bells, only the crackling of the hearth and the quiet prayers of Cranmer. Gardiner ordered the gates locked. "No word must escape," he declared. "Not until the boy is safe." Norfolk Evergrim stood before the dead king and whispered, "So ends an empire of terror. Begins another," murmured Wriothesley, not quite quietly enough. Hours passed before the council delivered the news to Prince Edward. The child stood beneath an arched window, watching the fog rise from the river. When Hertford entered, the boy turned, startled. "Is it true?" Edward asked. Hertford nodded slowly. "Your Majesty." Edward said nothing for a moment. Then, "May God forgive him. The coronation was not yet scheduled, but already men knelt before the boy. The Lord Chancellor wept." Cranmer kissed his hand. The servants bowed, unsure if they feared the boy or pitied him. Edward remained composed, but in his eyes danced a fire that had not been there before. Uncertainty, fear, and the crushing weight of inheritance. That night, a storm fell upon London. Rain lashed the windows of Whitehall, and lightning illuminated the empty bed where Henry once lay. His body had been taken to the Chapel Royal, but his presence lingered. Some said his ghost prowled the corridors. A maid fainted upon seeing a tall figure limping through the gallery. Others heard muffled weeping from the king's library, though it stood locked and barred. Henry's will was read in secrecy. It was vast and contradictory, a document of paranoia and indecision. He left lands to his daughters, debts to the nobility, and authority to a council that already warred with itself. No one could agree on its meaning. Some believed it forged. Others claimed it a final act of tyranny, to leave them all in confusion. On January 30th, the bells finally tolled. All London knew. Henry VIII was dead, and England held its breath. The body of the king was to be transported to Windsor. His coffin, enormous and lead-lined, bore carvings of saints and angels, though many whispered, it should bear the faces of those he had executed. 1,000 soldiers escorted it. Priests chanted dirges, nobles followed on horseback, black-cloaked and tight-lipped. The procession moved slowly through muddy roads. Peasants watched from hedgerows. Some crossed themselves, others spat. In Sion Abbey, where the coffin rested one night, a terrible thing occurred. Blood seeped from the coffin. The monks said it was a miracle, a sign of divine displeasure. Others whispered it was rot, but when a dog was found licking the blood and fell dead by morning, rumors spread like wildfire. God rejects him, they said. In Windsor, the coffin was sealed within St. George's Chapel. Priests sang, nobles knelt. Edward watched from a gilded chair, small hands clenched. In his lap, his father lay below, encased in darkness, beneath marble and iron. England mourned, but uneasily. The tyrant was gone. The boy king reigned, and beneath the stones of Windsor, Henry's body began to bloat. The first signs came days later. A terrible smell seeped from beneath the chapel. Guards were replaced hourly. Flowers wilted, mice fled. The priests doubled their incense, but it could not mask the scent of corruption. Some claimed the king would not rest. Catherine Parr dreamt of him nightly, his face half-eaten, eyes burning. Cranmer awoke with bruises he could not explain. Wriothesley claimed to see Henry's face in every mirror, and in the Privy Council, already divided by ambition, accusations began to fly. The king was dead, but his curse had only begun. The day Edward VI was proclaimed king, the palace halls were hushed with apprehension. The servants wore black, their steps muted as though afraid to disturb the ghosts, now haunting Whitehall. Amidst the shadows, the boy king was dressed in ceremonial finery, a robe too large, a crown too heavy. His coronation was set weeks ahead, yet from the moment Henry VIII drew his last breath, Edward was monarch in name. Still, the child understood little of what power had now passed to him. He knew grief, fear, and the keen awareness of watching eyes. Every lord, bishop, and courtier who knelt before him seemed to judge his worth with hidden calculation. Edward sat in the council chamber, legs dangling above the tiled floor. Around him, the men of his father's will gathered like wolves in velvet. Edward Seymour, his uncle and new Lord Protector, the calculating Bishop Gardiner, the suspicious and aging Norfolk, and Wriothesley, who smiled too easily. "My lords," Edward said timidly, reading from a scroll written in another's hand, "let it be known that I accept the protection and guidance of my council, and shall reign with God's wisdom and your counsel." Seymour bowed. Gardiner did not. That night, Seymour visited Edward alone. They sat before the fire in the boy's new apartments, lavish but chill with mourning. "You must not fear them," Seymour said. Edward studied the flames. "They fear me?" Seymour chuckled. "Not yet, but they will." The days that followed were filled with formalities. Documents were signed, heralds dispatched, and nobles summoned to swear fealty. Edward's tutors doubled their efforts, teaching him Latin, history, scripture, and kingship. But Edward had little interest in the state. He asked about his mother, Jane Seymour, whom he never knew. He asked if his father had loved him. He asked why Catherine Parr cried in the chapel. No one answered plainly. By the third week, the nightmares began. He saw his father, bloated, rotting, eyes gleaming with fury. In his dreams, the king's crown melted into his flesh, fusing with his skull. He screamed, and Edward would awaken drenched in sweat. He confided in Catherine Parr. She held him as a mother might, whispering prayers until he calmed. "It is the devil in your thoughts," she told him. "Do not let it take root." But the dreams worsened. At court, rumors flourished. The boy king was weak, they said, too pale, too soft. Some mocked his devotion to prayer. Others feared Seymour's growing power. Seymour, now Duke of Somerset, had the Tower's keys and the Privy Seal. He issued proclamations in Edward's name. He purged rivals with quiet efficiency. Gardiner, pushed aside, began whispering rebellion among the old guard. Norfolk was arrested again. Wriothesley disappeared. Edward noticed none of this. His days were filled with books and sermons, his nights with ghosts. In early February, Catherine Parr brought the boy to the old king's library. It remained locked, but Catherine had the key. The dust was thick. The hearth had gone cold. Cobwebs clung to tomes Henry had once cherished. Books of war, law, theology, and forbidden arts. "Why are we here?" Edward asked. "To understand him," Catherine said. "Your father feared ignorance. He believed knowledge was power." She placed a book in his hands, De Principatibus, by Machiavelli. Edward read aloud, faltering on the Latin. "Better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both." Catherine watched him. "Do you understand?" "I think so." That night, Edward burned with fever. He dreamed of a throne of swords, his hands bleeding as he tried to sit upon it. His father laughed in the shadows. "You are not ready." By mid-February, Edward began to change. He spoke more firmly. He memorized laws. He asked hard questions. He ordered new paintings, his face stern, eyes forward, hand upon a Bible. One day, he summoned the council and asked, "Who taxes the wool merchants of Calais?" They blinked in confusion. Edward smiled. In secret, he began keeping a journal. He wrote of the weather, his dreams, the sermons he heard. But he also wrote of men, of Seymour's temper, Gardiner's defiance, the way Norfolk flinched at shadows. He observed them like a scholar, dissecting their strengths and flaws. He was becoming his father's son. Then came the crow. It perched on the window of his study one morning, black, silent, unblinking. It remained for hours. Servants tried to shoo it, but it would not move. Edward stared at it. "Is it a sign?" he asked. Catherine said no. Gardiner said yes. Seymour had it killed. But that night, another came. Edward began to hear whispers in the chapel during Mass. He would glance over his shoulder. In the library, the pages of books turned by themselves. At dinner, the flames of the candles swayed without wind. He prayed longer, slept less. One night, the door to his chamber creaked. Open. A cold wind stirred the tapestries. A shape lingered by the hearth. A figure in fur, hunched and groaning. "Father?" Edward whispered. The shape vanished. The boy did not sleep for 3 days. In March, preparations for the coronation began in earnest. Tailors arrived with silks. Bishops rehearsed liturgies. Architects inspected Westminster. Edward sat alone. Looking at his crown, he picked it up, held it in both hands. It was lighter than he remembered. "I am ready," he said aloud, and from the shadows, unseen, something whispered back, "No, not yet." The coronation came on a cold April morning, skies brooding with rain. Westminster Abbey glittered with gold and incense, though the air inside was heavy, less with awe than unease. Edward, robed in white and crimson, stood beneath towering arches, his small frame lost in the grandeur of monarchy. As the crown was placed upon his head, he felt neither joy nor triumph, only the ache of weight and the whisper of unseen eyes. The lords and bishops bowed. The crowd outside roared. Yet behind the cheers there was fear. Weeks passed. Edward's reforms began slowly. Protestant preachers returned. Latin prayers faded into English. Chantries were dissolved. Monasteries were stripped of wealth Henry had left untouched, but the cracks widened. In the north, the commons grumbled. Harvests had failed. Rents rose. Taxes deepened. In Devon, a spark turned into fire. Rebels gathered under old banners, crying for the old Mass, the old church, the old king. Edward read the dispatches in silence. "They are traitors," said Seymour. "They are frightened," said Catherine. Edward said nothing. But that night, he added to his journal, "How can a king lead if his people do not follow?" Gardiner returned to court. His exile short-lived. He came bearing a careful smile. "My king," he said, bowing low. "I come to serve, not quarrel." But Edward watched him closely. He remembered how Gardiner's mouth tightened at English psalms. Gardner met with Norfolk in quiet corners. Seymour's spies reported vague phrases: restoration, order, true faith. Seymour demanded arrests. Edward refused. "If we silence them," Edward said, "they become martyrs." Instead, he summoned Gardner alone. "M.A. Not my father," he said. Gardner smiled. "Indeed not, Majesty. I have no need of hounds in bishop's robes." The smile faded. "You walk a narrow ridge," Gardner warned. "As do you," Edward replied. That summer famine clawed at the shires. Reports of bodies in the roads reached court. Seymour called for grain levies. Merchants resisted. Riots broke out near Norwich. A second rebellion rose. This one bore a darker name: the Rising of the Broken Cross. Peasants marched beneath banners defaced with black paint, crosses inverted, the Christ figure missing. When Edward read the report, he went pale. "Blasphemy," whispered Catherine. "Desperation," Seymour muttered. Edward summoned his council. "Send no sermons, no proclamations," he said. "Send bread and soldiers." By autumn, victories came, but they rang hollow. Rebels were hanged by the dozen. Fields were scorched. Churches boarded shut. The people quieted, but out of fear, not peace. Seymour reveled in the victories, yet enemies circled. Thomas Seymour, his ambitious brother, spoke against him in the shadows. Courtiers whispered of tyranny. Some called for Gardner to replace him. Edward observed it all. He watched the lords more than the realm. He marked each move as if playing chess. He learned what his father had never taught him: to listen. That winter, the ghost returned. It came, not in dreams, but in the mirror. Edward stared at his reflection one evening and saw another face, a bloated, angry shadow behind his own. Henry's face. "Are you proud?" Edward whispered. The shadow grinned. Later, in his journal, Edward wrote, "Is power inherited or stolen from the dead?" Rumors began to spread, of curses laid upon the crown, of a sickness born in royal blood. Priests spoke of omens. Birds fell dead from the sky in York. A comet blazed above London. Some called Edward a child prophet. Others called him cursed. He said nothing, but in secret he wept. In the tower, a prisoner wrote poems to the moon. Her name was Anne. She was old now, forgotten. Her beauty faded like ink in rain. Yet, in her dreams, she saw a girl dancing in white, a girl with red hair and a crown made of light. "Elizabeth," she whispered. The next morning, Anne Boleyn was found dead in her cell. They said she had not spoken in years. Edward dreamed of her that night. She did not speak, but pointed west, where the sun set in blood. He awoke to find his nose bleeding, the pillow soaked with crimson. The year turned, and London held its breath. Snow fell thick along the Thames, muffling the sounds of a kingdom in turmoil. Edward VI, now more solemn than ever, began to rule not by edict, but by observation. The boy who once shivered beneath his crown had grown shrewd, though not yet strong, and Edward Seymour, Lord Protector of England, began to feel the frost beneath his boots. The first blow came quietly. Gardner, ever patient, approached Thomas Seymour with whispered promises. "Your brother keeps you from the throne," he said, "but your nephew needs you, not Edward. You." Thomas Seymour, proud and restless, drank the poison slowly. He began to plot. Letters, bribes, whispered gatherings with discontented nobles. Edward watched. In his journal he wrote, "One uncle guards me, the other claws at my throne. How long before they tear each other apart?" The second blow came louder. Kett's rebellion flared again in the east. The people cried for land and justice. Seymour rode north with banners and cannon, promising swift peace. But the peace did not come. The rebels scattered into forests, attacking supply lines, raiding grain stores. Seymour's men were slow, hungry, and cruel. Reports of atrocities reached the court. Villages burned. Women wept. Priests hung from trees. Edward summoned his council. For the first time, he presided alone. Seymour acts not as guardian, but as king, Gardner said. Catherine Parr, grown weary, said nothing. Edward nodded. And a king who fails to feed his people must fall. On a gray morning, Thomas Seymour was arrested. He had broken into Edward's chambers under cover of night, dagger drawn, muttering about saving the boy from his brother's tyranny. The guards found him standing at the foot of the royal bed, eyes wild. He was dragged away screaming. The next week he was executed. Edward did not attend. But he wrote, "The price of ambition is silence. His voice is gone now." The nobles turned. Gardner gathered allies. Norfolk returned to favor. Letters circulated accusing Edward Seymour of abuse, misrule, and heresy. When Seymour returned to court, weary and victorious in name only, he found the gates shut. He demanded entry. The yeoman of the guard refused. A warrant was read. "By order of King Edward VI, you are under arrest." Seymour laughed. "The boy? You let the boy decide?" But as they bound his hands, he looked up at the palace windows. Edward stood there, watching. The boy did not flinch. Seymour was imprisoned in the Tower. His trial was swift, driven more by fear than fact. Edward refused to speak at the proceedings, but he sent one letter, read aloud. "Let no man believe he stands above the crown. Protector is not king. England shall have one voice. Mine." Seymour's execution was ordered. Gardner delivered the news personally. "Will you die well, my lord?" he asked. Seymour stared past him. "Better than I lived." On the scaffold, Seymour faced the crowd. He saw no tears, only silence. He knelt. The axe fell. Edward watched from afar. He returned to his room, burned Seymour's letters, and wrote, "I am alone now. The voices are gone, yet I feel them still, beneath the floor, behind the walls." That night, Edward dreamed of a banquet, all. The faces were familiar. His father, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Thomas Seymour, even Wolsey. They dined in silence. Their mouths moved, but no sound emerged. Edward sat at the head of the table. Before him, a plate of ash. The room darkened. Candles went out one by one. Only one voice remained, cold and ancient. "You wear the crown, but we bear its weight." Edward awoke, choking on smoke. The hearth had gone cold. His sheets were blackened, but there was no fire, only ash. Spring came to England, but joy did not. The bells of Westminster rang not for celebration, but for mourning. Edward, thin and ghost-like, took to his chambers more often. His cough worsened. Physicians muttered of consumption, though none dared speak the word before him. He spent long hours by the window watching the world below. "I see the kingdom," he said to Catherine, "but I do not feel it." "You are young," she replied. "No," he said, "I am tired." Gardner grew stronger. Parliament bent to his will. The mass returned in secret corners. Those who had championed reform now grew silent. Edward's reforms were repealed one by one. Books burned. Priests vanished. Latin crept back into the air. The boy king, once a beacon of change, now watched his kingdom slide backwards, and he had no strength to stop it. In his journal, he wrote, "What is a crown when the head beneath it rots? What is England if truth is bartered for fear? They smile at me, but they wait for me to die." Elizabeth visited him. She had grown tall, fierce in gaze and word. "They want your crown," she said. "They want it from you too," Edward replied. They sat in silence for a while. Then he asked, "If I die, what will you do?" She said, "Live, fight, learn." He nodded. "Good, one of us must." By June he could barely walk. Servants carried him to council. He spoke softly, but the words still cut. "I am not dead yet." To Catherine he whispered, "If they crown Mary, England will burn." He ordered a will drawn, my devise for the succession. Mary, the Catholic, was excluded. Jane Grey, his cousin, a Protestant girl of quiet strength, was named heir. The council hesitated. Gardner raged. Norfolk warned of civil war. But Edward's Hand trembling, signed the paper. "I will not be the last flame of reform," he said. He died on July 6th. No great cry went up. No mourning procession spilled into the streets. The boy king passed as he had lived, shadowed by giants, consumed by ghosts. He was 15. When they laid him in Henry's tomb, the stone cracked. Some said it was an omen. Others said it was the weight of too many lies. Jane Grey reigned for 9 days. Then Mary came. Blood followed. Catherine fled the court. Elizabeth was imprisoned. The Tower's ravens grew fat. The churches burned again, this time with people inside. And somewhere beneath the palace stones, a voice still whispered, "You wear the crown, but we bear its weight." In a locked chamber in Whitehall, Edward's journal remained hidden. Its final words, "The throne is not a chair. It is a coffin with a crown atop. If you sit upon it, beware the ghosts beneath. I was a boy. I was a king. I was neither."